I never thought that owning a plow would lead to a full-blown war, but that's exactly what happened. It wasn't a war with tanks and trenches, but one fought with certified letters, obscure bylaws, and the sheer, unyielding weapon of petty tyranny. My name is Mark, and for 10 years, I'd lived a quiet life in Maple Creek Estates. I ran a small landscaping and snow removal business, a one-man operation that kept me busy and paid the bills. I liked the simple satisfaction of a neatly edged lawn or a perfectly cleared driveway. I was the kind of neighbor who'd wave as you drove by but probably wouldn't invite you over for a barbecue. I valued my peace, my work, and the unspoken agreement in our neighborhood to just let people be. Maple Creek was built on that principle. It was a sprawling subdivision of well-kept but unremarkable houses, a place people moved to for the good schools and the quiet streets. Our homeowners association was, for most of its existence, a benign entity. It was managed for years by a gentleman named Mr. Henderson, a retiree whose primary goal seemed to be exerting as little effort as possible. The HOA dues were $100 a year, which paid for mowing the little patch of grass by the entrance sign and replacing the light bulbs on it when they burned out. The annual meetings were attended by maybe 5 people, lasted 15 minutes, and involved coffee and stale donuts. It was less a governing body and more a neighborhood formality, and that's how we all liked it. That all changed when Carol Preston bought the corner house on Sycamore Lane. She arrived like a weather front, a disturbance in the placid atmosphere of our community. She was a woman who seemed to vibrate with a restless, managerial energy, a refugee from a corporate world where she'd clearly enjoyed wielding authority. She saw our sleepy, barely functional HOA not as a relic of a simpler time, but as a fixer-upper, a project. Her project. Within 6 months of moving in, she'd attended a meeting, lamented the lack of community standards, and somehow managed to get herself elected president after Mr. Henderson finally sold his house and moved to a condo in Florida. The changes started subtly, like the first few drops of rain before a deluge. A newsletter appeared in our mailboxes, printed on garish yellow paper. It was full of new regulations, most of them pointless. Trash receptacles could no longer be visible from the street, except between the hours of 6 p.m. the day before pickup and 8 p.m. on pickup day. Holiday decorations had to be removed within 10 days of the holiday in question. There was a new, complex approval process for any exterior modifications, including painting your own front door. People grumbled. It was annoying, a solution in search of a problem, but it wasn't worth starting a fight over. So, we moved our trash cans and took down our Christmas lights on schedule. We ceded that little bit of ground, not realizing we were funding her war chest and feeding the very beast that would eventually try to devour us. Then came the storm. It wasn't just a snowstorm, it was a meteorological event, the kind they give names to on the Weather Channel. It came in fast and furious, dumping nearly 3 feet of heavy, wet snow in less than 24 hours. The wind howled, piling drifts up against doors and burying cars completely. The state declared an emergency. Everything shut down. For the first day, it was almost cozy. I had a full pantry and a stack of firewood. But by the second day, the novelty had worn off. The city plows were completely overwhelmed, focusing only on the main arteries. Our little network of streets within Maple Creek was at the bottom of the list, and it was clear no one was coming to dig us out anytime soon. I had the tools. My Ford F-250 was fitted with a heavy-duty commercial plow, the heart of my winter business. I also had a beast of a snowblower for sidewalks and tight spaces. After clearing my own long driveway, which took a solid hour, I looked across the street at Mr. Gable's place. He was in his 80s, a widower who lived alone. His walk wasn't shoveled, his car was a lump under a mountain of white, and I knew there was no way he could handle this. So, I fired up the snowblower and cleared his walkway and the front of his garage. He watched from his front window, waving with a look of immense gratitude. It felt good. It was the neighborly thing to do. But then I looked down the street. It was the same story at every house. Everyone was trapped. I had the equipment, I had the time, and I had a full tank of gas. It wasn't even a conscious decision. I just got in my truck, lowered the blade, and started plowing. I cleared the main loop through the subdivision, pushing the snow into massive piles on the wide, grassy boulevards between the sidewalk and the street, the same places snow had been piled for as long as I'd lived there. It took me most of the afternoon, but by dusk, there was a passable lane through the entire neighborhood. People could get out if they had to. An ambulance could get in. I didn't ask for a dime. I just went home, exhausted and sore, feeling like I'd done a good day's work. The next morning, there was a sharp, insistent pounding on my front door. It wasn't the friendly knock of a neighbor. It was an official, authoritarian rap. I opened the door to find Carol Preston standing on my freshly cleared porch. She was bundled in an expensive-looking ski jacket, her face a mask of grim satisfaction. She wasn't holding a thank you card. She was holding a clipboard. "Mark," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "We need to discuss your activities yesterday." I was taken aback. My activities? You mean the plowing? I was just trying to help everyone get out. She consulted her clipboard as if it were a sacred text. According to the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association bylaws, Article 7, Section 4, the operation of commercial-grade equipment for the purposes of property maintenance is prohibited, except by vendors officially contracted by the association. She looked up at me, a smug little glint in her eye. "Your truck, with that plow, is commercial equipment." I stared at her, trying to process the sheer absurdity of it. "Carol, people were snowed in. Mr. Gable couldn't have even opened his garage door. Are you serious?" "I am always serious when it comes to the covenants of this community," she replied, her tone icy. "Furthermore," she continued, pointing a gloved finger towards the street, "you have violated Section 9, concerning the disposal of waste materials. You've created unapproved snow piles on common-use land. All snow is to be deposited on the homeowner's own property." I actually laughed. "On my own property? Carol, there are 3 feet of it. Where are people supposed to put it? In their living rooms? We've always piled it on the boulevards." Her expression didn't change. "The past is not a precedent for improper procedure. The rules are the rules." She unclipped a piece of paper from her board and handed it to me. It was an official HOA letterhead, with a formal warning typed out. It cited the 2 sections she had just quoted. "This is your official written warning. The snow piles you created must be removed from the common areas and relocated to your own property within 48 hours. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $500, with an additional fine of $100 for each day the violation remains uncorrected." I read the letter, then look back at her, my disbelief curdling into anger. "You want me to move those snowbanks? The ones that are 10 feet high and run the length of the entire street? How exactly do you propose I do that?" "That is your problem to solve, not mine," she said, turning to leave. "You created the violation. You must rectify it." 48 hours, Mark." She walked down my porch steps without another word, a petty tyrant leaving a decree in her wake. I stood in the doorway, the cold air rushing in, holding a piece of paper that felt more like a declaration of war than a simple warning. The peace in Maple Creek was officially over. For the next 2 days, I did nothing. I was furious, but I was also convinced that she couldn't be serious. It was a bluff, a power trip. No reasonable person would expect me to move literal tons of snow from a public boulevard back into my own yard. It was physically impossible. Besides, the sun was out. The snow would melt eventually. This was a problem that would solve itself. I underestimated her. I badly underestimated the depths of her vindictiveness. On the 3rd day, another letter arrived in my mailbox, this time via certified mail. It was a formal notice of violation and a bill for $500. The reason cited was failure to rectify the improper placement of snow on common areas. The letter was cold, clinical, and promised further action if the fine was not paid within 30 days. I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. This was a line in the sand. I wasn't going to pay a fine for helping my neighbors. The situation began to escalate in ways I hadn't anticipated. The massive snow piles I had created began to melt during the day and refreeze at night, creating slick patches of ice along the edges of the road. A week after the first letter, a second one arrived. This one contained another fine, this time for $250, for creating a hazardous condition on community property. The letter helpfully suggested that this new hazard was a direct result of my failure to address the first violation. The total was now $750. But Carol wasn't content just targeting me. She expanded her campaign. Mr. Gable called me one evening, his voice trembling with anxiety. He had received a violation notice of his own. The fine was for $200, for the infraction of utilizing an unapproved and unlicensed vendor for snow removal services. She was fining an 80-year-old man on a fixed income because I had cleared his driveway for free. That was when my anger solidified into something colder, harder. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about cruelty. The impact on the community was palpable. A cloud of fear and resentment settled over Maple Creek. The mail carrier, a friendly woman named Denise, complained to me that she was having trouble delivering mail because some of the boxes near the large snow piles were difficult to access. She said Carol had personally come out and lectured her about driving her truck on the edge of the grass. A few days later, the O'Malley's daughter had an asthma attack in the middle of the night. The ambulance had a hard time navigating the icy patches near the melting snowbanks, and the paramedics had to carry their gear an extra 50 feet. They lost precious minutes. Mrs. O'Malley told me later that Carol had the gall to send them a warning for the ambulance parking partially on a neighbor's lawn. People were angry, but they were also afraid. They saw what was happening to me and to Mr. Gable, and they didn't want to be next. I'd see neighbors at the grocery store who would suddenly become fascinated by a display of canned beans when I walked down the aisle. The friendly waves were replaced with nervous glances. Carol had successfully isolated me, turning my act of community service into a cautionary tale. I was the nail that stuck up, and she was hammering me down with methodical glee. The fines kept coming. Every week, a new envelope. Failure to pay the initial fine. Continued non-compliance. Accrued interest. The total climbed past $1,000, then $2,000. I ignored them all. Then came the letter that I couldn't ignore. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of, a firm apparently retained by the Maple Creek HOA. It was a formal notice of intent to place a lien on my property for the unpaid fines, which now amounted to a staggering $3,400, including legal fees. A lien. That was real. That could affect my mortgage, my credit, my ability to sell my house. This wasn't just a matter of principle anymore, it was a direct threat to my financial stability, to everything I had worked for. My quiet life was being systematically dismantled by this woman's obsession with control. I knew then that I couldn't fight this alone. I was out of my depth. I needed a professional. I found Ben Carter through a referral from a client. He was a lawyer whose entire practice was dedicated to the arcane and often vicious world of homeowners association disputes. He had a small, cluttered office downtown, and he listened to my story with a look that was equal parts weary and intrigued. He leaned back in his chair when I was done, tapping a pen on a stack of legal files. "Let me guess," Ben said, a wry smile on his face. "Your HOA president is a recent retiree from a middle management position, isn't she?" "Yeah, how did you know?" "It's a common profile," he said, shaking his head. People who spend their lives in a structured hierarchy where they have a little bit of power, they get lost when they retire. An HOA is the perfect place for them to rebuild their little fiefdom. They have the power to fine, to foreclose, to make people's lives miserable, all under the guise of protecting property values. It's a petty tyrant's paradise. He looked over the stack of violation notices I'd brought with me. "She's definitely overreaching," he concluded. "Fining an old man for getting his driveway shoveled for free is vindictive, and it's probably not enforceable. The problem is, fighting it costs money. They use the HOA's funds, your money, by the way, to hire their lawyers, while you have to pay out of your own pocket. They can outspend you and wear you down. That's their primary tactic." My heart sank. "So, what can I do?" Ben leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "You can't just fight the fines. You have to fight the person. We need to go on the offensive. You, as a homeowner, have the right to inspect the association's records. All of them. Financial statements, bank records, contracts, meeting minutes, everything. We need to find out where the money is going. People like Carol Preston, they're often not just bullies. They're usually hiding something. He gave me a checklist of documents to formally request in writing. She'll try to stonewall you, he warned. She'll delay or claim the records aren't available. But the law is on your side. You have a right to see those books. Start there. Dig into every dollar they've spent since she took over. Look for anything that doesn't smell right. A contract with a company you've never heard of. Payments for services you've never seen. That's where we'll find our leverage. I left Ben's office with a renewed sense of purpose. I was no longer just a victim. I was an investigator. That evening, I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board, citing the specific state statutes Ben had given me, requesting access to a comprehensive list of financial documents. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested. The war had just entered a new phase. As Ben predicted, Carol stonewalled. A week after she signed for my letter, I received a response. It was a condescending, 2-paragraph note stating that my request was overly broad and would be unduly burdensome to fulfill. She informed me that I could schedule an appointment to view the approved annual budget summary at her home, at a time of her convenience. It was a classic dodge. I wasn't asking for the summary, I was asking for the raw data, the invoices, the cancelled checks. I forwarded her response to Ben. His reply was swift, perfect. She's breaking the law. Send a second letter. Inform her that failure to comply with a legitimate records request within the statutory time limit will result in legal action, for which she and the board may be held personally liable for all associated costs. This time, I had Ben's firm co-sign the letter. The threat of personal liability seemed to do the trick. 2 weeks later, I received a grudging email from Carol telling me a box of documents was available for my inspection. She made me come to her house to review them. She sat me at her dining room table, the box of files placed just out of reach, and watched me like a hawk the entire time, as if I might try to steal her precious records. The box was a disorganized mess of receipts, invoices, and bank statements, all jumbled together. It was a deliberate attempt to make the task as difficult as possible. I spent 3 painstaking hours sorting through the chaos, taking pictures of every single document with my phone. Carol sighed dramatically every few minutes, making it clear what an imposition this was. I ignored her, focusing on the numbers. I spent the next several nights at my kitchen table, piecing together the financial puzzle of the Maple Creek HOA. For the most part, it was boringly predictable. The water bill for the sprinklers at the entrance. The electric bill for the sign. The invoice from the company that mowed the common areas in the summer. But then I found it. Tucked away in a folder labeled Grounds Maintenance, Miscellaneous was a series of invoices that made my pulse quicken. The invoices were from a company called Prestige Garden Solutions. I'd never heard of them. I knew every landscaping company in the area. It was my business, after all. The charges were substantial. $5,000 for fall cleanup and winterization services, another $3,000 for tree and shrubbery trimming, a recurring charge of $800 a month for winter grounds monitoring. These were services that had never been performed. I knew for a fact that the fall cleanup had been done by the same local crew that had been doing it for years, for a third of that price. And winter grounds monitoring? That wasn't a real thing. I looked at the invoices more closely. They were professionally printed, but generic. There was no phone number, just a mailing address, a P.O. box in the next town over. I pulled up the state's corporate commission website on my laptop and did a business search for Prestige Garden Solutions. The results came back in seconds. The company had been incorporated just 8 months prior, shortly after Carol had become HOA president. My eye scanned down to the field for the registered agent, the individual legally responsible for the company. The name listed was Carol Peterson. Peterson. It took me a moment to place it. I did a quick social media search for Carol Preston, and there it was, on her public profile, a picture from a family reunion. The caption read, "So good to be with my brother and his family. Love my Peterson roots." Peterson was her maiden name. A cold, clear certainty washed over me. She had created a shell company using her maiden name and was billing the HOA, billing her own neighbors, for thousands of dollars in phantom services. She wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was a thief. Then I found the second piece of the puzzle, the one that tied everything back to the snowstorm. Buried deep in a folder of old documents from Mr. Henderson's time was the original agreement with the city regarding public services. As I suspected, it stated that the city was responsible for snow removal on all public streets, including those in our subdivision. But attached to it was an addendum, signed by Mr. Henderson 5 years ago. It was a waiver. In exchange for a small reduction in property taxes, the HOA had voluntarily assumed responsibility for snow removal on its own streets. It was a foolish move, made by an old man trying to save a few bucks a year on dues, but it was legally binding. I went back to Carol's budgets. Sure enough, for the past 5 years, there had been a line item for snow removal contract, budgeted at $10,000 a year. Under Mr. Henderson, that money had been paid to a legitimate local company. But in the budget Carol had created for the current year, the line item was still there, the $10,000 was still allocated, but there were no corresponding payments to any plow company. The money was simply gone. It had been transferred, in a series of lump sums, to the HOA's reserve account, which Carol had sole signatory authority over. From there, the trail went cold, but I had a very strong suspicion where it led. She had taken the $10,000 meant for a snowplow service, pocketed it, and then when the inevitable blizzard came, she had the unmitigated gall to fine me, the one person who did the job for free. She wasn't just fining me for breaking a rule, she was fining me for exposing her own dereliction of duty and her own greed. It was a breathtaking display of corruption and arrogance. Armed with this information, I felt a fundamental shift inside me. This was no longer a defensive battle against unjust fines. I was now on the offense. I had the truth on my side, documented and undeniable. I called Ben the next morning and laid it all out for him. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Well, he finally said, a note of genuine admiration in his voice. "You got her. You got her dead to rights. This is textbook embezzlement and fraud. Mark, this is no longer just an HOA dispute. This is a criminal matter." Our strategy changed instantly. Ben advised me against going to the police right away. "They'll get involved," he said, "but we have a unique opportunity here. The HOA annual meeting is in 2 weeks. It's the one time of year you're guaranteed to have the whole community together as an audience. A public forum. We're going to expose her in front of everyone she's been terrorizing. We'll let the court of public opinion pass its judgment first." The plan was simple, and it was theatrical. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing. With Ben's guidance, I put together a slide presentation. I scanned the fake invoices, the corporate registration with her maiden name, the bank statements showing the payments to Prestige Garden Solutions, the city waiver, and the budget with the missing $10,000. I laid it all out in a clear, chronological narrative. I didn't have to embellish a thing. The facts alone were damning. I also started talking to my neighbors, but quietly. I went to Mr. Gable first and showed him what I'd found. The color drained from his face. He insisted on calling his son, David, who was a CPA. David looked over my evidence and confirmed my conclusions. He was furious. He started making a few calls of his own. Word began to spread, not as a wild rumor, but as a quiet, determined hum. Something was going to happen at the annual meeting. For the first time in the history of Maple Creek, it was going to be an event no one wanted to miss. The night of the annual meeting arrived. The community clubhouse, a small building usually reserved for children's birthday parties, was packed. I'd never seen more than 20 people at one of these things, but tonight, there must have been over 100. Every seat was taken, and people were standing along the walls. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. I saw the O'Malleys, the mail carrier Denise, and dozens of other faces I recognized, all of them wearing the same grim, expectant expression. Carol Preston sat at the head table with her two bored cronies, a pair of meek individuals who seemed to just rubber stamp her decisions. She looked out at the massive turnout with an expression of pure, unadulterated pleasure. In her mind, this was a testament to her leadership. She thought these people had come to admire her. She had no idea they were a jury, and I was the prosecution. She started the meeting with her usual self-congratulatory drivel. She talked about the new standards, the improved aesthetics of the neighborhood, the importance of fiscal responsibility. I could feel the collective blood pressure in the room rising with every word. She droned on for what felt like an eternity, completely oblivious to the mood of the room. Finally, she got to the end of her agenda. And that brings us to new business. Does anyone have anything to discuss? She asked, a smug smile on her face, clearly expecting silence. I stood up. I do. Every head in the room turned towards me. Carol's smile faltered. Ah, Mark. I trust this isn't about your outstanding financial obligations to the association, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. It's about the association's financial obligations to us, I said calmly. I walked to the front of the room, carrying my laptop. David, Mr. Gable's son, was already there, having set up a projector and screen for me. I requested and reviewed the association's financial records for the past year, as is my right as a homeowner. I have some questions I'd like to share with my neighbors. Carol's face began to tighten. This is not the proper forum for a personal grievance. This isn't a grievance. It's a financial review, I said, plugging my laptop into the projector. The first slide appeared on the screen behind her. It was the cover page, a financial review of the Maple Creek HOA. For the next 15 minutes, I walked the entire room through my findings. I spoke calmly and stuck to the facts. I put the first invoice from Prestige Garden Solutions up on the screen. I'm sure we were all grateful for the $5,000 worth of fall cleanup performed by this company, I said, my voice laced with irony. A murmur went through the crowd. They knew who did the cleanup, and it wasn't some company called Prestige. I clicked to the next slide. It was the corporate registration document. I used the laser pointer to circle the registered agent's name, Carol Peterson. I was curious who owned this company that was receiving so much of our money, I explained. It turns out the registered agent is a woman named Carol Peterson. Does anyone know a Carol Peterson? Silence. Then, David Gable's voice boomed from the back. Isn't Peterson your maiden name, Carol? Carol shot up from her chair. This is an outrageous slander. My personal life is none of this association's business. Her face was turning a blotchy red. I ignored her and moved to the next slide, which showed the bank statement with a direct payment from the HOA account to the Prestige account. Slander requires the statement to be false, I said. This, however, is a bank record. The room erupted. The murmurs became angry shouts. Thief, someone yelled from the back. But I wasn't done. But it gets worse, I said, raising my voice to be heard over the din. I brought up the slide with the snow removal budget. As you all know, I was fined several $1,000s for plowing our streets for free during the blizzard. According to our president, I was violating the bylaws. I then displayed the waiver agreement with the city. What President Preston failed to mention is that the HOA is, in fact, responsible for clearing our streets. She also failed to mention that our budget, which we all paid for with our dues, allocated $10,000 for a snow removal contractor this year. I clicked to the final slide. It was a bank transfer statement showing $10,000 being moved from the general fund to the reserve account. That money was never spent on a contractor, I concluded, my voice ringing with clarity in the now silent room. It was transferred into an account that our president has sole control over. She took the money meant to keep us safe, let us get buried in a blizzard, and then find the one person who stepped up to help. The collapse was total and immediate. The two board members sitting next to her looked at the screen, then at Carol, their faces a mixture of horror and betrayal. One of them, a timid woman named Sandra, pushed her chair back from the table as if Carol were contagious. The crowd was on its feet, roaring. Accusations flew from every corner of the room. Carol stood there, sputtering, speechless. Her authority, her entire constructed world of rules and power, had evaporated in the space of 15 minutes. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked around the room, at the faces of the neighbors she had bullied and fined, and saw nothing but contempt. Then, the back doors of the clubhouse opened. 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside. Someone, it turned out to be David, had quietly slipped out and called them as soon as I started my presentation. They made their way through the parting crowd. One of the officers calmly approached me and asked to see the documents. The other walked over to the head table. He said to Carol, his voice calm but firm. "I think it would be best if you came with us. We have some questions we'd like to ask you down at the station." Carol stared at him, her face ashen. Her reign was over. Her little kingdom had crumbled into dust. She was escorted out of the meeting she had so proudly convened, to a chorus of jeers and righteous anger from the neighbors she had so profoundly underestimated. The meeting was over. The war was won. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The district attorney's office took one look at the evidence I had compiled and pressed charges immediately. Faced with an ironclad case of embezzlement and wire fraud, Carol Preston's lawyer advised her to plead guilty to avoid a trial and a potentially much longer sentence. She was convicted on multiple felony counts. The judge was not amused by her betrayal of her community's trust. She was sentenced to 5 years of probation, ordered to pay full restitution of every single dollar she had stolen, a sum totaling over $22,000, plus hefty fines. A key part of the sentence was a court order that permanently barred her from ever again serving on the board of any corporation, charity, or community association. She could never hold a position of trust again. Back in Maple Creek, the healing began almost immediately. The 2 remaining board members resigned in disgrace at an emergency meeting held the following week. An interim board was appointed, with David Gable, the CPA who had helped me, as the new president. Their first official act was to pass a resolution to void all fines and violations issued by Carol against me, Mr. Gable, and several other residents she had targeted. They issued a formal letter of apology on behalf of the HOA, which was sent to every homeowner. The lien against my property, which had never been officially filed, was now a moot point. I didn't want a reward or recognition, but I got it anyway. People stopped me in the street, not to avoid me, but to shake my hand and thank me. My business, which I had worried would suffer, actually saw a small boom. Several neighbors insisted on hiring me for their landscaping, saying they wanted to support the guy who stood up for the neighborhood. It was humbling. I was never a hero, reluctant or otherwise. I was just a guy who got pushed too far and decided to push back with the only weapon I had, the truth. The HOA itself underwent a radical transformation. Under David's leadership, a committee was formed to rewrite the bylaws from scratch. The new rules were based on common sense and reason, not on a desire for control. All financial records were made available online for any homeowner to inspect at any time. Transparency became the new watchword. The annual dues were lowered, since they were no longer funding a personal slush fund. The neighborhood felt lighter, friendlier. The cloud of suspicion and fear that Carol had cultivated had been blown away, replaced by a renewed sense of community. We had gone through a trial by fire together, and we had come out stronger on the other side. A couple of years passed. Maple Creek settled back into its quiet rhythm, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the comfortable silence of a community at ease, not the fearful silence of one under oppression. We had more block parties. People talked to each other over their fences again. The shared experience of overthrowing a petty tyrant had bonded us in a way that years of peaceful coexistence never could. We learned that the price of liberty, even in a small suburban subdivision, is eternal vigilance. I saw Carol one last time, about a year after her conviction. Her house had gone into foreclosure. The bank had seized it to help cover the restitution she owed. I was driving my truck through the neighborhood on my way to a job when I saw her. She was loading a few cardboard boxes into the trunk of a dented, decade-old sedan. She looked tired and diminished, a shadow of the imperious woman who had stood on my porch lecturing me about bylaws. All the arrogant energy was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out defeat. She saw my truck and froze for a moment. Our eyes met across the length of her overgrown lawn. There was no anger in her gaze, just a weary resignation. In that moment, I didn't feel any triumph or satisfaction. I just felt a quiet sense of pity for a life so thoroughly wrecked by its own small-minded greed. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of everything that had happened. I nodded back, a simple gesture of closure, and then I drove on. There was nothing left to say. Sometimes, when a big snowstorm is forecast, I think about Carol and the whole absurd ordeal. It's a reminder that the worst kinds of bullies aren't always the ones who use their fists. Sometimes, they use clipboards and rulebooks. They weaponize procedure and thrive on the apathy of others, counting on the fact that most people would rather put up with injustice than go through the trouble of fighting it. But what I learned is that when you push a reasonable person too far, they stop being reasonable. They start digging. They start asking questions. And they find that bullies and tyrants, big or small, almost always have a weakness. They are often hiding a secret, a lie, or a crime that is far worse than the petty offenses they persecute others for. Exposing that truth is like turning on a light in a room full of cockroaches. They can't survive the exposure. The story ends where it began, with me in my truck. Another winter, another blanket of fresh snow covering the quiet streets of Maple Creek. I lower the blade, the familiar scrape of steel on asphalt echoing in the cold morning air. I clear my driveway, and then I move across the street to do Mr. Gable's. I'm just a guy with a plow, doing my job, helping a neighbor. The difference is that now, I know my community has my back. We are a neighborhood of neighbors again, not a kingdom of rules. And that is a peace worth fighting for.